All right, welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack as we're following the latest, especially with the federal takeover in our nation's capital. But it's not the only city, especially sanctuary cities around the country, that the Trump administration is focusing on. For more on this, let's go out right now to Connor Hansen with the latest on a crackdown at different sanctuary cities.
With a mariachi band playing in front of her, Boston Mayor Muriel Bowser said her city won't be swayed by the federal government's efforts to change its sanctuary policies.
Stop attacking our cities to hide your administration's failures.
Attorney General Pam Bondi sent a letter setting a Tuesday deadline for cities to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, saying the federal government will cut off funding if local governments don't comply.
We are going to send in law enforcement just like we did during the LA riots, just like we're doing here in Washington, D.C.
Boston does not allow its police to cooperate with ICE in civil immigration enforcement, and Mayor Wu signed an executive order in June demanding that ICE provide information on who the agency is arresting in Boston. Boston isn't alone. Washington State, Colorado, and the city of Hoboken, New Jersey say they don't plan to change their stance.
If these sanctuary politicians won't follow the law, then we will be forced to flood the zone. We're hiring more than 10,000 new ICE enforcement officers. We have about 110,000 applications.
The DOJ has already filed lawsuits against cities like New York, LA, and Chicago over sanctuary policies. In New York, Connor Hansen, Fox News.
All right, thank you so much for that. And another city we've talked about quite a bit here on Live Now from Fox is our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., in the crosshairs in terms of crime and new developments right now as the Department of Justice is investigating the crime statistics there. As Fox 5 posting on social media, the Justice Department reportedly investigating, well, whether the Metropolitan Police Department manipulated data to create a false illusion of safety as they have opened this investigation and where police officials falsified data to make crime rates appear lower than they are. Let's bring into the conversation right now a nationally recognized data analyst with expertise in evaluating criminal justice data, Jeff Asher. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And it's interesting that DOJ now taking a look, going through fine-tooth combed through some of this data. What do you make of this development?
Well, there's certainly clear evidence, especially with respect to robbery and what they deem assault with a dangerous weapon, that the numbers that they're reporting on the publicly available website are probably overstating the degree to which violent crime is dropping. As far as I can tell, the murder figures they're reporting, all of the property crime figures they report, the carjacking figures they report match up pretty closely with what they're reporting to the FBI. That said, you know, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There is the allegation of mispractice here. There's not necessarily a lot of evidence, and unfortunately, dealing with crime data a lot, crime data is sometimes badly kept, badly reported. Crime data errors, they drive me nuts as someone that uses the data, but it's also not something that is totally out of left field, and DC would be the only agency that has mistakes.
Yeah, and we ask about this because you mentioned the violent crime, and that is going to be kind of the big term that people latch to. And DC has noted, even when the takeover was taking place, that violent crime was down in their most recent report. Could it be not necessarily a falsification, but just a recategorizing some of this data?
It's possible, and of course, agencies, they certainly have no legal responsibility to report data on their websites. So the data that they are reporting to the federal government, there doesn't appear to be any issues with that. In fact, DC actually reported a 7% increase in aggravated assaults in 2024. So if they're trying to cover up aggravated assaults in the data they're reporting to the federal government, they're certainly doing a bad job of that. The data on their website, it could be due to falsification. It's something that you certainly can't rule out. And if it is true, if an internal investigation identifies that, they wouldn't be the only city that's ever happened in. That said, even diving deep into the data, it doesn't show that a single district commander is reporting data that's a trend that's in that doesn't match what other districts are showing. So it's possible, but I think it's a long way from where we are now to actually showing and proving that there's evidence of such manipulation.
And then, of course, we're talking about some administrator being put on leave due to potentially allegations of this as well. I do want to ask you, because the District of Columbia, very unique in its own right. I know you studied crime in different cities like New Orleans, and I know there's other different. How does the District of Columbia work into this? Because they do report to the federal government, unlike maybe directly other cities, other states.
So the way that it works in pretty much every state is that the local police department will report data to what they call a state UCR program, a state uniform crime report program. The state program will tally it all up. They'll make sure there are no reporting errors, and then they will report it to the federal government. They have really a long time. They have until next spring to report this year's data. So if there are errors, and there frequently are errors, they have a long time to catch it, fix it, and when the FBI reports its final data, then they're reporting something that has been basically audited and caught. DC, of course, doesn't have a state program. It has itself. And so they work with the federal government and report data directly. In this case, this could certainly be an example of not having that extra layer leading to something that was not reported correctly. Really, only time and investigation internally will tell.
And another component of this is we've seen the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro, kind of latch on to potentially crime made by teens, people under the age of 18. How do they factor into this crime data?
So it's complicated. DC is like a lot of places where obviously you don't want to downplay juvenile crime. There are incidents, and sometimes very high-profile incidents involving juvenile perpetrators. That said, 92% of the people that were arrested in 2024 were adults. Only 8% were juveniles. Things like carjackings tend to have a significantly more disproportionate percentage of those are committed by juveniles, or at least the people arrested for them are juveniles. So we've seen a big decline in the number of juveniles that have been arrested for carjacking. That really reflects what we saw in DC, which was this big surge in 2020, another big surge in carjackings in 2023, and then drops in 2024 and 2025 so far. That said, carjackings, auto thefts, vehicle burglaries, these are offense types that tend to have a much higher share of the perpetrators are juveniles relative to all other crimes, which the vast majority are committed by adults.
Yeah, that is so very interesting. I wanted to get into it. I also want to ask, because we talk about this crime data being down, or that's what the DC are reporting, since the National Guard deployed to our nation's capital, since they have really taken over the police department in our nation's capital, they're saying the Trump administration is that crime is down, but it obviously leans to it. The more police on the street, potentially the more arrests. How could this couple of weeks, the time that they have taken over some of the police department, show of force in our nation's capital, sway the data at all?
I'm personally a little bit skeptical, especially in such a short time frame. And you're talking about not law enforcement, but National Guard, which means you're not talking about trained officers. They aren't responding to 911 calls. They aren't investigating homicides and adding resources to your detectives and improving your clearance rate. So I don't know, especially in such a short time, that you would necessarily see any change in the data. That said, there's not a huge number of cities where we've ever seen something like this attempted in a crime reduction capacity. So I think it's certainly something that if there is a reduction, we'll have to wait, but very rarely do you see any type of intervention that has a sudden, immediate effect. And so it's been a week since the officers were deployed. I don't imagine we'd necessarily see an enormous effect anytime in the next week, or really in the next couple of weeks, or even into the next few months.
Yeah, it's just a very small sample size, although President Trump has said other cities might be taking note of what's going on in our nation's capital. Does what's happening in Washington, D.C., not necessarily with the takeover, but just in terms of crime and the reporting of the data, remind you of any other cities? I know you specialized in New Orleans. Does it remind you of anything going on in different metropolitan areas around the country in previous years?
Well, DC looks like a lot of cities right now. It had a huge surge in murder in 2020. It sort of stayed that way through 2023, and it has come down significantly. We know this from DC's data. We can see it in the DC Health Department gunshot injury data. We can see it in places like the Gun Violence Archive, which measures shootings. So we know that it's still high, but it's falling, and it's falling fast. And actually, there were the same number of murders through July this year as there were in 2019, so pre-pandemic. A lot of cities had this. DC, like a lot of cities, had a big increase in carjacking. DC, like a lot of cities, had a big increase in auto thefts. These things have come down significantly, but they're still at a level that's kind of elevated relative to where they were pre-pandemic. And so I think that we have to be able to hold these two concepts in our heads. The level, you could say, is not acceptable. DC still has a murder problem. It still has a violent crime problem. These are things that we need to find solutions to, while also appreciating that the trend for the last 20 or so months has been strongly downward, and that there's probably things in DC and in lots of cities throughout the country that we can learn about that are affecting the crime rate that should go into what we societally do in order to address crime that we can still see as a big problem.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, just the complexities of this are very interesting, but you mentioned just kind of the strong trend, at least downward, and some strong allegations by the DOJ today. Jeff, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Great insight here on Live Now.
Thanks for having me.